Hi, I'm Mabus, and this is Exploring VR and AR with Polyolygon. This is the first of a two-part presentation on these technologies, with this one focused on virtual reality and the following one focused on augmented reality, although we cover the difference between the two here as well. The objective of this presentation is threefold. One, to understand VR as a technology and where it stands today. Two, to understand the market landscape by looking at some of the biggest key hardware and software players in this space, all with the goal of three, to see how this technology can be leveraged to help achieve the goals of post-secondary success. Before we begin, we need to get familiar with some terminology. VR, AR, MR, 3DoF, 6DoF, there's a lot of terms and acronyms to learn in this space. To keep things fast and simple, we're only going to cover these terms as needed. Right now, the most relevant being virtual reality, or VR, and augmented reality, or AR. They share a lot of the same technology components, but from different means and for different ends. When we say virtual reality, we're talking about a technology in the form of a headset that transports you into a completely virtual environment. Both your eyes and ears are generally covered for total immersion. More advanced systems even have 3D hand controllers, which allow you to use your hands to interact with things in a virtual space. When we say augmented reality, we're talking about technology that brings virtual elements into your real world. AR technology enhances your real-time, real-world perspective with computer-generated data. Unlike VR, this doesn't necessarily have to be in a headset either. Both Pokemon Go and Snapchat Faces are a great example of augmented reality on the phone using your phone's camera. There's a lot of ground to cover with just VR, so we'll be saving AR for the following presentation. Virtual reality can be split up into two types of experiences: VR applications and VR video. VR applications are software experiences made for VR headsets. They're usually built using 3D game engines. They allow you to move around virtually in an open space and even interact with virtual objects. VR video is essentially a video stream wrapped all the way around your head. It doesn't allow you to move around freely or interact, but it's a lot easier to produce and a lot easier to share, including outside of VR headsets onto websites like Facebook and YouTube. Within a VR headset, both of these experiences are made more immersive using a concept called stereoscopics. It involves showing a slightly different image for each eye, just like in real life. It's beneficial because it helps create the illusion of depth you naturally see. If I merge these two images together and fade them in and out, you can see the items closer to you have greater movement. Things in the far distance don't change much. As a side note, this is a similar concept to the 3D movies you saw in the 80s. You know, the ones with the cheap blue and red glasses? They allowed each eye to see a slightly different picture using a single image, albeit not as effectively. It's worth noting that neither of these experiences are purely better than the other and serve different use cases. VR applications are best when you want to be able to interact with your environment and not just look around. It requires a lot more work to produce, however, and is not generally created by a single individual. 3D models and landscapes need to be painstakingly modeled and textured, and the more realistic you make it, the more processing power is needed for viewing the scene. Creating VR video, on the other hand, can be as simple as pressing the record button. It's the only way to reproduce live experiences today, for example, sharing a concert with friends or reliving your family vacation. Just as VR applications can be limited by processing power, VR videos is limited by video size, quality, and internet bandwidth. We'll talk about those limits in more detail in another slide. Now let's talk a little bit about the promise of VR. The last few decades were a very exciting time for virtual reality in books and cinema. From Tron in 1982 all the way to The Matrix in 1995, people saw VR's limitless potential. Almost 20 years after the release of The Matrix, this is what we have instead, in 2014. How many of you have tried Google Cardboard? Not the best experience. And this is what we got just 2 years later in 2016. Last year, we saw an unprecedented number of phenomenal VR experiences coming out. These aren't just tech demos, but actual experiences occurring in consumer homes on consumer devices. Is the VR that was always around the corner finally here? What changed and how did we get here? In order to understand, we need to take a step back to the 90s, the last time VR was big and failed. Though VR technology can be traced back to the 50s and 60s, they were just one-off experiments. Real commercial mass-produced VR came to a head in the 90s. By 1991, we began to see the first publicly accessible VR at scale in the forms of huge VR gaming pods at arcades and amusement parks, led by a company called Virtuality. They were big, clunky systems with low-quality graphics, but they were a novelty people had never seen before and were excited to try. At $130,000 per pod in today's dollars, these devices weren't cheap for arcade owners and inaccessible for average consumers. The novelty soon wore off. By 93, major game console developers were excited to capitalize on the interest for consumer VR by getting VR in the home, and this made a lot of sense as personal computers didn't really exist in most homes yet. Sega VR was made to be cheap and affordable at $200. During testing, though, users complained of motion sickness and severe headaches. The product was canceled before it even went to market. The industry learned that price wasn't the only factor for swaying consumers. The experience had to be good. 2 years later, in 1995, Nintendo stepped up to the plate with Virtual Boy. It looked like a step in the wrong direction with its monochrome red and black display, but it actually did have one thing going for it. It didn't make people sick. It became the first home video game console to successfully make it to market that was capable of displaying stereoscopic graphics. It sold over 1 million units. Unfortunately, after sluggish sales, the Virtual Boy was canceled. Despite being both relatively cheap and not making people sick, it flopped because it wasn't really that immersive. The biggest thing it lacked is head tracking. You can only look through it like a stationary set of binoculars. From 1995 to 2000, we continue to see the release of notable PC-powered headsets like the VX F1. The VX F1 was revolutionary for having stereoscopic 3D, multiple axis head rotation, and even simple 3D hand tracking with a device they called the Cyberpuck. The $599 price point, which is about $1,000 today, kept it out of most people's hands. From around 2000 to 2012, the VR industry fell out of mainstream consciousness, left to be tinkered by hobbyists only. Companies just couldn't make headsets that were cheap, immersive, and didn't make you sick. It was only 2 out of the 3. Since hardware performance wasn't really ready, people focused more on 1,000 songs in your pocket in 2001, followed by the smartphone revolution in 2007. Which makes a lot of sense because can you imagine having a great consumer VR experience before simple music players or smartphones? In 2 words, what really killed 90s VR was the lack of immersion and presence. Immersion in virtual reality is the feeling that you're really physically somewhere else. Your eyes, ears, and brain are successfully fooled. It's important to note that when immersion is close but not quite right, that's when you get sick. The popular theory behind this is that your reptilian brain thinks you've been poisoned and wants the contents of your stomach out. It's the same thing that happens when you're seasick or carsick. Once you feel immersed, the next goal is for you to feel you have real presence in your virtual environment, that you can walk around and interact in virtual space naturally just like in real life, where you can affect the environment and the environment is affected by you. It takes 4 key pieces of technology to create immersion and presence in VR. The display and processor are the first 2 of these key components. Good immersion requires you to have a display with a high enough resolution and large enough viewing angle to be believable. When we look back at VR in the 90s, we see the highest end consumer VR device, the VX F1, had a per eye resolution of about 260 by 230 pixels. That's the resolution of this black box you see on the screen. Imagine that stretched out to fill your entire vision. The VX F1 also had a viewing angle of about 45 degrees. Contrast that with today's headsets that have nearly 20 times the resolution per eye and double the field of view. The processor is the second key component that's needed to create immersive VR. It's used to create the actual scenes you see through the headset. The more detailed the scene, the more powerful a processor is needed. I'm sure you've heard of Moore's Law. It was an observation in 1965 that transistor density in circuit boards double approximately every 2 years at half the cost. It has been an accurate observation for over 50 years until it finally started slowing down in 2013. Transistors can be considered the brains of the CPU. The red area shows the time between 2000 and 2012 period. As an example of the power of Moore's law, you can walk out of the Apple store with an iPad today that is more powerful than the fastest supercomputer available in 1995. Once you successfully have immersion, the building blocks on top of that is presence. The two key technologies that help create presence in VR are sensors for tracking your movement and input devices for interacting. Combined together, these four technologies are key for a great VR experience. These are also all technologies that the 90s didn't do so well. With that understanding, we go back to our timeline to 2012 to the birth of the modern VR movement. Interestingly enough, if you remember the Moore's Law slide, we probably had the capacity to create decent VR equipment a year or two before this in 2010 or 2011. Why didn't we? My answer is that 90s VR failed so spectacularly that no large company was apt to try it again, and no small company could afford the risk until someone else proved it was ready. That finally happened with the Oculus Rift Developer Kit 1, which was unsurprisingly not funded by a company but crowdfunded online. It was created by an 18-year-old VR enthusiast named Palmer Luckey. Luckey was a homeschooled kid from Long Beach, California, who'd like to tinker in his parents' basement with old VR devices. He saw that after over a decade, the technology for good VR had been ready and built a prototype to prove it. Needing funds to mass-produce the DK1, he created a Kickstarter campaign in late 2012 with a goal of raising $250,000. The goal was surpassed within 24 hours, and the campaign ended up raising close to $2.5 million instead. What's more, Luckey delivered on his promise, shipping out quality headsets to all of his nearly 10,000 backers a year later in 2013. Following the successful deliveries, Oculus was able to raise $90 million in funding by the likes of Andreessen Horowitz and Spark Capital and began immediate work on Developer Kit 2 in 2014. Just 7 months later, Oculus was acquired by Facebook for $2 billion. For many, this was the final validation that the technology to support VR was finally here. A few months after Oculus's acquisition, Google joined the fray with the introduction of Google Cardboard. Priced at only $5, it introduced dirt cheap VR for the masses by letting you use your smartphone as a VR device. This was a smart idea because your phone has 1, a high resolution screen, 2, a built-in gyroscope so your phone knows its orientation to the earth, and 3, a built-in accelerometer so it can understand your head movement. To date, Google has shipped 10 million cardboard units. 2014 also saw the introduction of the Developer Kit 2, the second generation Oculus Rift. It featured a slimmer design, higher resolution screen, and lower latency, meaning the time it takes the screen to refresh as you're looking around. The DK2 also introduced something interesting: an external camera sensor to be able to track your movements. You see, up until this point, all VR headsets had what we call 3 degrees of freedom, or 3DoF for short. It means you can rotate your head in any direction and the VR system will understand what you did. These 3 degrees are titled yaw, pitch, and roll. What VR systems can't track is your physical movement in space. We call this type of movement translation, and that's why an outside camera is needed. Combining 3 degrees of rotation with the 3 degrees of translation gives us 6 degrees of freedom, or 6DoF. In this example, we can see that when using an outside sensor, we can do things like lean in, or peek around a corner, or over a ledge in VR. Things that you couldn't really do before. In the industry, we call this capability desk scale. Moving on to 2015, we saw Samsung enter the fray with the first release of a modern mobile VR platform, the Samsung Gear VR. Think of it as a souped-up version of Google Cardboard with better stats all around and dedicated side buttons for controlling your experience. One additional thing to note is that Samsung, being a hardware company, uses Oculus's software, including App Store, to run VR experiences. This has the benefit of allowing Facebook to control the VR app market for both PC and mobile VR platforms. That's huge. Samsung has also been among the most aggressive in new hardware releases, with up to 3 hardware updates to the Gear VR per year. They also remain one of the most popular devices for a decent VR experience for $100 outside the requirement of having an Android phone. 2016 was the biggest year for VR in history, with a lot of new and legitimate contenders entering the space. It started in January with Oculus releasing the long-awaited consumer version 1, known as CV1. With bumped up specs and an improved outside camera, it still remains one of the best VR experiences today. At $599 and also requiring a PC with a high-end video card to run, it's also among the most expensive. A month after the CV1 was released, the HTC Vive shipped as the second major PC-based VR platform. This platform was developed by a partnership between two companies, smartphone manufacturer HTC and the Valve Corporation. You may have heard of HTC before for their higher-end Android phones, but you might not have heard of Valve. Valve is a video game developer known for creating some of the best VR game titles such as Counter-Strike. They're more than just a game studio though. They've also created a software distribution platform called Steam. Steam is the largest digital distribution platform for PC games with over 3.5 billion in sales per year. And unlike the previous two headsets, the HTC Vive doesn't use Oculus Home but Steam VR, an extension of the Steam platform. This marks the first real threat to Facebook's VR dominance in both software and hardware. And on top of comparable price and quality to Oculus, the HTC Vive came with something that Oculus didn't: motion controllers. Oculus had been promising this feature for a long time but was constantly getting delayed. For the next 7 months, HTC Vive remained the only platform to allow users to fully interact in VR environments with their hands. That's a lot of missed sales for Oculus. The last feature that HTC Vive supported that Oculus didn't is full room scale. You can literally walk around in virtual reality as opposed to sitting at a desk. This is accomplished by what Valve calls lighthouse sensors attached to 2 corners of your room. These sensors give the headset and motion controllers sub-millimeter positional accuracy. What's interesting is that in an effort to move the VR industry forward, the lighthouse technology, which was created by Valve, is available to any company that wants it. We may even see Oculus adopting it in the future. The third consumer VR platform released in 2016 was the PlayStation VR. Unlike the Oculus and Vive, which are Windows PC-based platforms, PlayStation VR targets the PlayStation 4 video game console, which is already in approximately 60 million homes worldwide. Though late to the game and not shipping until October, PlayStation VR, by industry estimations, has sold more units than Oculus and Vive combined in a much shorter time frame. This is likely a result of lower barrier to entry at $399 for existing console owners for a decent high-quality experience and the lure of major VR game titles only available on PlayStation. Don't be fooled though, the PlayStation VR is better than mobile VR experiences like Gear VR, but isn't at the level of PC-based headsets. It simply doesn't have enough processing power from a console that's 4 years old. The fifth and last major VR platform released in late 2016 is Google Daydream. Though it was the last to ship, it very well may become the most popular VR platform in 2017. That's because the Daydream software platform is now built into the Android operating system starting with Android 7.1. That makes it the only mobile VR platform that is automatically built into an operating system, which is pretty huge. As of 2016, there is approximately 107 million Android phone users in the US, and at $79 price point, Google can gain VR market share quickly. Daydream will only work on certain newer Android phones though, but as Android users upgrade, they will find themselves automatically supported. And there we have it. Not just 1, but 6 VR platforms released by the end of 2016, which is why 2016 has been dubbed the year of consumer VR. Not to overwhelm you, but in 2017, we're seeing many other PC manufacturers preparing to enter the market but haven't yet. HTC is slated to release a yet-to-be-named wireless headset without Valve that is said to need no PC or phone to run. And companies like Lenovo, Acer, Dell, and HP will sell headsets by Christmas. All of these headsets will be running Microsoft Windows 10. This is because back in 2015, Microsoft had announced its mixed reality platform built into Windows 10 called Windows Holographic. That platform initially revolved around the AR and MR with HoloLens covered in our next presentation, but has now been renamed the Windows Mixed Reality Platform, which now includes VR for Windows and the future Xbox One successor. If you're confused, don't worry about it. None of these headsets exist yet, and we'll update these slides with more information as they're released. Now that we've established the 6 consumer VR platforms that are out right now, how do they compare with each other? First, we can compare and contrast the platform types our 6 devices fall into: mobile low-end or passive headsets, mobile high-end or active headsets, and PC console-powered headsets. One big difference between the mobile and PC console categories to mention right off the bat is mobile VR headsets lack the external sensor for positional tracking, so you don't get room scale. They also generally only come with one 3DoF remote as opposed to two 6DoF motion controllers. On the mobile low end, we have passive headsets that are completely unpowered and essentially just provide 2 lenses and a box to place your mobile phone in. The pros are that they are the most affordable solutions at around $15 or less, or even distributed for free by companies promoting 360 video and VR content. The cons are that they offer limited immersion and performance without the major hardware, software, and display optimizations that come from higher-end headsets. The experience can contain significant judder, or the appearance of shakiness, and motion blur, which can make you nauseous. On the mobile high end, you have active mobile headsets. They look unassuming but are powerful VR platforms in their own right, closer to their desktop counterparts than a mobile low-end device like Cardboard. They are optimized for performance, comfort, and long-term VR use, so attract higher-end applications and experiences. The pros are that they feature ergonomic construction with dedicated proximity sensors and real physical operating buttons. Instead of using the phone's sensors, which aren't optimized for VR, they use their own high-performance sensors for very smooth head tracking and low judder. As mentioned, they're often bundled with a single external motion controller with 3 degrees of freedom. The cons are that they require specific newer models of Android phones and don't support other mobile platforms such as iPhone or Windows phones. And they have a steeper price tag at $79 to $129. Lastly, intensive VR experiences can cause phones to overheat and require you to take a break to let them cool down. With 2 consumer platforms in the high-end mobile category, which one do we choose? The pros of Gear VR is that it's the most mature mobile hardware platform, having constant refinement since 2015 and more than 700 apps developed for it. It also has major adoption with over 5 million units shipped to date. That's more than any other device since Cardboard. It also has a VR software platform from Oculus, which is really polished and stable. Lastly, it has the greatest support of mobile devices today since it can be used with the latest few versions of Samsung Galaxy phones, the most popular phones in the world. The pros of Google Daydream is that it's more affordable at $79 for the headset and motion controller compared to $129 for the Gear VR bundle. It will also be the de facto Android VR platform going forward as it's built into the operating system. The answer could actually be both. Samsung released their latest flagship Galaxy phone, the S8, in April, and it's said to work with both Gear VR and Daydream. A potential huge blow for Facebook, but a big benefit for the rest of us. One interesting thing to note is that hardware players like Samsung don't really care what platform they use and will readily switch up. They just want to sell more hardware. While on the other side, software players like Valve will give away their hardware innovations like Lighthouse so that they can sell more software. Moving on to the PC console category, we find the headsets that offer the best VR experiences to date. Because these headsets are tethered to way more powerful systems than mobile phones, they're able to render graphics at a way finer detail. Benefiting from the higher price point, their custom high-resolution displays and hardware are created just for VR instead of working around any limitations of a phone's display and operating system. Other benefits include being the only systems that currently offer true room scale or 6 degrees of freedom. They are also the only VR devices that have motion controllers with full 6 degrees of freedom. The cost of having the best experience comes with a lot of cons, including higher prices for the headsets and the need for a high-end PC computer with powerful graphics card, or a PlayStation 4 system for the PlayStation VR. This is an additional cost of about $400 to $1,000 if you don't already have a PC or a PlayStation. Another con is that both Oculus Rift and HTC Vive only work with PCs running Windows. Mac and Linux aren't currently supported, but maybe in the future. The single biggest other con is being tethered. Each headset has a long wire or braid of wires coming off the headset to the computer or game console. While not too heavy or distracting, it does prevent you from truly experiencing room scale without worry. You always need to be conscious of where you are in relation to the wires. Lastly, PC and console systems are not mobile and require some time to set up. HTC Vive in particular requires mounting 2 sensors onto your wall to create a dedicated play area. Regarding room sensors, these 3 systems use completely different ways to track you and your motion controller's movements. The HTC Vive's Lighthouse trackers shoot invisible light throughout the room. Both the headset and its motion controllers are covered in little photosensors. Each time a beam hits the sensors, they mathematically calculate their exact position by tracking which sensors were hit and when. The Oculus Rift does the opposite. It tracks invisible infrared LEDs coming off the headset and controllers and monitors them for positional changes. This is similar to the technology powering the Nintendo Wii controllers. Though the Oculus Rift only comes bundled with 1 positional tracker, up to 3 are recommended for true room scale. The PlayStation VR probably uses the worst form of tracking. It uses what is essentially 2 closely spaced USB webcams to track bright neon colors that glow on the headset and controllers. It can get confused easily by your home's lighting, and it can't see the motion controllers if you place them behind you. Here's a comparison of each system's motion controllers. Interestingly, both the HTC Vive and Oculus Rift have similar looking controllers, while the Samsung Gear VR and Google Daydream also look similar to each other. The only system that looks drastically different is the PlayStation VR, which reuses Move controllers that predate the PlayStation VR itself. Let's talk about the biggest pros of each platform. The biggest pros of Oculus is that it's the most recognized platform. It also has notably better headset ergonomics and comfort compared to HTC, although HTC isn't bad. It also has built-in over-the-ear headphones. Oculus has the most polished platform experience with a more curated app store full of high-end exclusive titles. With a recent price drop, the Oculus bundle is $600, $200 cheaper than Vive. HTC Vive, on the other hand, features more bells and whistles like a built-in front-facing camera. It's currently being used with a chaperone bounds system to make sure you don't hit a real wall in VR, but could be used in the future for other mixed reality stuff too. The HTC Vive's Lighthouse sensor technology is far superior to Oculus for room-scale VR. Platform-wise, SteamVR is built around an OpenVR standard they developed, allowing past and future third-party headsets to use SteamVR too, including Oculus Rift. The 2 biggest pros for the PlayStation VR is that it's probably the most comfortable VR headset. It has an adjustable headband that sits on the crown of your head that the rest of the system hangs on. The VR screen area barely touches your face while still forming a good light-blocking seal. The PlayStation VR is also the most portable of the 3 systems, with no PC or any kind of computer experience needed to get up and running. If we were to choose one PC and console platform for building educational experiences, which one would we choose? Though popular, the PlayStation platform targets gaming and entertainment pretty exclusively, and its VR quality is not quite up to par with the others, so that leaves us with the Oculus Rift or HTC Vive. The Rift and Vive are pretty neck and neck in terms of stellar VR quality, but for true room scale, the HTC Vive wins, if that aspect is important to you. In terms of quality education content, both platforms support license-free development. Anyone can release applications for these platforms for free. However, if your goal is to also target mobile devices, creating your app for Oculus Home could enable you to work with both the Oculus Rift and the Samsung Gear VR. If your goal is to also produce software for regular Windows, Mac, and Linux platforms, producing apps for SteamVR will let you target both HTC Vive and desktops. When selecting a serious VR headset, the question most people will ask today is mobile or tethered. If you go with mobile, then you go with either Gear VR or Daydream. If you go with tethered, it's either Oculus Rift or HTC Vive. There are, however, a few other headsets not mentioned yet but still notable for one reason or another. The most prominent outsider headset is the OSVR, which stands for Open Source Virtual Reality. It has decent specs, slightly lower than HTC and Oculus. This platform exists almost as a lobbying platform to convince the industry to open source their technology to avoid fragmentation. The Fove Zero is the first headset dedicated to eye tracking, meaning the headset can tell what you're looking at in VR. Fove raised $500,000 from Kickstarter in 2015 and went on to raise $11 million in Series A. I don't think we'll hear much about Fove in the US as they are focusing on adoption in internet cafes in Asia, but the eye tracking technology is incredibly useful for VR in many ways and will most certainly be adopted by all major headsets eventually. Last, we have the Star VR, a specialized panoramic headset targeting B2B applications instead of the consumer living room. Where most modern headsets have a field of view of about 110 degrees, the Star VR headset more than doubles it to 210 degrees, encompassing your entire field of vision, including peripheral. A Swedish game studio called Starbreeze partnered with Acer to build this headset and is working closely with IMAX to create IMAX VR centers to offer this premium experience to moviegoers. It's currently still in beta. Now that we're familiar with the major hardware players in the VR space, let's look at some different types of VR experiences. When people think of VR, they usually think of immersive racing games, or space and flight simulators, or even first-person shooters. And they're all amazing in their own right, but let's showcase some of the more useful and interesting VR experiences. Google Earth VR, available on both HTC and Oculus Rift, is one of the most powerful uses of VR right now. You can travel to cities you've never been or walk around neighborhoods of your childhood home. Though much of this technology has been available on your PC, it's a whole other ballgame when the experience is all around you. Google uses a technology called photogrammetry to convert satellite imagery in various angles into detailed 3D textured landscapes. This technique is a common way to generate objects for VR, from the size of a baseball to the size of the Grand Canyon. Like Tilt Brush, which we saw earlier, Oculus Medium is an immersive VR application that not only lets you draw, but also sculpt, model, and paint objects in a VR environment. From designing cars or new appliances, companies have traditionally started with foam blocks or sculpted with clay. Oculus Medium digitizes this experience with a lot of potential to revolutionize design and development processes. The objects you create in Oculus Medium can be used in other VR applications or even 3D printed. The Climb, an Oculus Rift exclusive, is a polished experience where you can feel the thrill of extreme free solo climbing using your hands via motion controllers. It has some of the best quality graphics of any VR game and utilizes the 3D gaming framework CryEngine. VR is often assumed to be a solitary experience, but it can be a powerful tool for teamwork and collaboration, especially across distances. Star Trek Bridge Crew for the PlayStation VR is a great example of cooperative experiences with 4 players working together to complete space missions. Each member, from engineering to tactical officer, manages their role and responsibilities on the bridge in first person while the captain coordinates the mission. This relates well to classroom and group projects. Social interactions in VR extend past cooperative gameplay. AltSpace provides meeting spaces in virtual reality where users can have conversations with full 3D positional audio and participate in social events and screenings. AltSpace is also notable because it brings people together from multiple VR platforms. It's available on all major VR systems except for PlayStation. Big Screen shows the more utilitarian side of VR with productivity-based applications. Imagine working or studying in any environment you like, even working virtually together with someone miles away. Big Screen's platform enables people to use existing content, apps, and games in VR with others, even sharing desktop screens. You can have an unlimited number of virtual screens at any size. Big Screen's goal is to enable productivity, entertainment, and collaboration in virtual reality. It's available for both Oculus and HTC Vive platforms. The last item in our modern VR showcase is a clip from a 360 film called The Displaced, promoting empathy in video journalism. It gives you a first-person perspective into the lives of children during the modern-day refugee crisis. This video is one of many that is part of the New York Times VR Journalism Initiative, which was started in 2015. 1 million Google Cardboards were distributed to view this content. Now let's talk about some specific industry adoption in detail. One area of relatively fast adoption is training for high-risk industrial jobs. Practon Group is an Australian company that provides highly trained electrical and engineering professionals for mining and other large infrastructure projects. Recently, they've started using VR environments to safely train electricians on how to use high-voltage switches. According to Practon, VR environments have several advantages, such as large variety of training scenarios, ability to learn by failing, no operational downtime, and reduced training time and cost. This particular experience was built for HTC Vive, with full room scale and motion controllers, giving trainees that all-important hand presence throughout. VR is also notable in various healthcare applications. With a key sense of presence, virtual reality has been used for psychological and occupational exposure therapy since the 90s, and it's only becoming more effective with better and more cost-effective hardware. The US Pentagon backed a company called BraveMind to produce VR applications effective at treating PTSD, which is now used in over 100 military bases. In addition to PTSD, VR applications have been created for treating anxiety disorders, phobias including aerophobia, fear of flying, acrophobia, fear of heights, and glossophobia, fear of public speaking. Also in the healthcare field are new VR applications for surgical planning and training. Companies like Immersive Touch are creating not only simulations but hardware accessories for HTC Vive that allow realistic haptic and tactical feedback. You can really feel the physical pushback as you're virtually operating. There's been a heavy amount of VR in the real estate industry, especially around virtual property tours. San Francisco-based Matterport is one of the leaders in this space with a camera and platform to make it easy to create and distribute virtual tours. Like Google Maps Street View, the tour allows interactive 360-degree visibility from inside a home. Now Redfin and other common real estate websites have a View This in VR button. Matterport and others in the space are also working on ways of scanning your space with a mobile phone to convert a series of 2D images to 3D scenes, avoiding the need for specialized cameras. Architects and interior designers are utilizing VR software like Ulio, which plugs into CAD design software, to bring floor plans to life to be inspected in first person. This allows people to experience the building before it's built. Most of the industry applications we've shown use VR applications, but VR for broadcasting and live events is where VR video shines. Analysts expect VR for live event broadcasting to be a huge part of the future of VR. NextVR, for example, has raised $80 million at an $800 million valuation in 2016. They focus on streaming live sports and music content and have signed deals to publish live stereoscopic VR video courtside at the NBA, as well as popular music concerts with 3D positional audio. Lowe's, IKEA, Wayfair, and other retailers have all made VR applications to view their products inside your home before you buy it. Alibaba has been doing the opposite by bringing real shopping malls physically online. This is especially popular in China for recreating the shopping experience of US department stores like Macy's. Finally, let's get to what we've all been waiting for, VR for education. There's so much growth in this vertical that we've made it its own section. We'll be looking at education philosophy around VR, initiatives, grants, accelerators, companies, and products in the space. Why VR for education? We found many VR-based education companies reference the cone of learning, created by Edgar Dale, the American educationalist. The cone of learning proposes that after 2 weeks, the human brain tends to remember 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we hear and see, 70% of what we say, like participating in a class discussion, and 90% of what we do. This can be split into two categories, passive and active learning. Whether you agree with the cone of learning's specific retention percentages, I think you'd agree that doing something is way more memorable than reading or hearing it. VR's potential for learning through doing is already being used in corporate training. Walmart is planning to incorporate virtual reality in all of their 200 Walmart Academy training centers by the end of 2017 after a successful earlier pilot program. Their curriculum is being produced by Striver, a company previously known for helping NFL players train through VR. New Walmart employees will put on an Oculus Rift headset and enter different real-world scenarios during which they'll be asked to make simple choices based on what they see. The VR training covers experiences for the lowest level bagger all the way up to the store manager and seasonal encounters like Black Friday rush. Within a few years, Striver and Walmart hope to expand the program to all stores, not just the academies. In the same vein as Edgar Dale, American educational psychologist Dr. William Nguyen is best known for his research and theories on using cognitive and constructivist approaches for effective teaching strategies. The constructivist view of learning theorizes that people construct their own understanding and knowledge of the world through experiencing things and reflecting on those experiences. Basically, they're learning how to learn effectively instead of just memorizing answers. For example, take this 3D rendering of a steering differential used in all modern cars today. Instead of explaining to a student how it works, what about letting a student experiment with it in VR and explain to you how it works? In his 1993 paper predating modern VR, titled A Conceptual Basis for Educational Applications of Virtual Reality, William Wynn outlined many ways in which VR would benefit learning, including deeper interactivity, distraction-free immersion, self-guided learning and exploration, increased engagement, heightened levels of empathy, access to out-of-classroom experiences, being more accessible, and being more accommodating to various learning styles. Jumping forward to modern education research, Seattle-based Foundry 10 partners with schools to research and implement programs utilizing non-traditional learning methods. This includes dedicated programs and research on 12 topics ranging from early education to gender studies and VR in the classroom. They're especially interested in the commercial viability of VR in the classroom. In a 2016 research paper, they write that students clearly expressed to us that they know themselves as learners. As they interacted with more advanced VR headsets, they envisioned themselves learning in ways that were a better fit for them than traditional methods. Foundry 10 elaborates on this fundamental rethinking of what educational content might look like in VR with Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes is a commercial VR game that puts a student inside of VR to defuse a bomb. Students outside of VR have the manual and have to communicate numerous steps to disable it before it explodes. Foundry 10 outlines several adaptations of this game in classrooms for remedial English, team building and collaboration, to foreign language translation, and language fluency exercises. Learning in VR doesn't have to look the same as learning in the traditional classroom. Early forays in VR-based learning has generally centered on the hard sciences, biology, anatomy, geology, and astronomy, as they are effective in showing things like relative scale. Titans of Space was one of the pioneering education experiences for VR in 2014 and continues to evolve today. Like textbooks, these experiences are refined and reused year after year, but with the benefit of not wearing out. It remains one of the most downloaded education-based apps out there, and it was created by Drash VR LLC, mainly one guy who has been involved in other VR education initiatives like Apollo 11. Though use of modern VR hardware in the classroom is still in its infancy, another early practical application was a Google Cardboard education initiative called Google Expeditions. Expeditions promoted experience-based education by providing virtual class field trips using Google Cardboard. Teachers would lead groups of cardboard-wearing students with a tablet through a virtual library of over 100 trips from the Great Wall of China to Mars. These trips consisted of 360 panoramic photos annotated with descriptions and points of interest. You can see in the slide markers showing each student's live participation in a shared view of a trip. To avoid bandwidth requirements, teachers' tablets acted as a server for the students. No outside internet connection is required. Now in 2017, we're seeing games like Minecraft pushing the boundaries of how we can both entertain and teach through games. Minecraft is known as a sandbox game, a game wherein the player has been freed from the traditional structure and directions typically found in a video game and is instead given the ability to choose what, when, and how they want to approach the available choices and content. The term is in reference to a child's sandbox, in which no rules are present and play is derived from open-ended choice. In Minecraft, students build 3D worlds from textured blocks and their imagination. With more than 121 million copies sold, it was purchased by Microsoft in 2014 for $2.5 billion, and a virtual reality version is now available. In what's starting to become a common paradigm, a version of Minecraft with dedicated teacher workflows has been used in classrooms around the world to teach subjects ranging from core STEM topics to the arts. It's a great example of repurposing compelling commercial content for learning. When content is designed to be engaging and fun first, learning can occur comfortably. Irish company Immersive VR Education creates cinematic historical VR experiences like the Apollo 11 launch and Titanic. They also develop a free distance learning VR platform called Engage. Engage allows up to 30 users to participate in private lessons or meetings with presenter tools, interactive whiteboards, and streaming media. It seems each major VR platform has selected a main education partner. HTC has selected LiveLick to be provider of education VR content, developing high-quality room-scale education experiences on the HTC Vive. These experiences range from examining the Hubble telescope in space to interacting with dinosaurs, to viewing the body of a shark from the inside out while deep in the ocean. LiveLick already has many other non-VR learning products and concepts in the market with over 15,000 schools worldwide. California-based Unimersive is one of the educational partners in Oculus's Library Initiative. Unimersive's VR app is a platform for VR educational experiences. They claim it's the largest VR education content resource online. They publish new VR educational content every month. We're also seeing VR used in language learning and improving communication skills. Companies like Mondly, House of Language, and Virtual Speech. These applications use the VR microphone with cultural immersion, interactive environments, and distraction-free focus to develop these communication skills. The government sector is also interested in this space. The U.S. Department of Education has been encouraging the VR and AR educational space with a grant challenge. Concepts were due by January 2017, and out of 249 submissions, they announced 5 finalists in May. Each finalist was awarded $50,000 as they refine their concepts and build a simulation prototype. Finalists are eligible for $80,000 more on successful completion. One of the finalists, the Alfred Lab, created a series of VR patient experience labs, training students to become better caregivers of aging populations. These labs enhance empathy by allowing the user to become Alfred, an elderly man experiencing audiovisual age-related changes. The Alfred Lab uses HTC Vive with a Leap Motion attachment for hand tracking without motion controls. Another noteworthy finalist is Smart Sparrow. Their VR product, LifeCraft, explores the story of life on Earth through VR. Journeys range from archaeology and biology to astronomy. Smart Sparrow actually received a $4.5 million grant from the Gates Foundation in November 2014 as part of its $20 million Next Generation Digital Courseware Challenge. Speaking of investments, Boost VC is an example of a VR-focused accelerator in Silicon Valley with more than 50 investments in VR to date, including a few in education that we've mentioned like Unimersive and Virtual Speech. They have a few other interesting investments to check out like Aloha VR, which assists elderly individuals with dementia and depression. The 2016 Horizon report from the New Media Consortium predicts that immersive virtual reality technology is likely to have a large impact on teaching and learning in higher education worldwide within the next 2 to 3 years. The growing affordability of VR technologies are leading to increased adoption in higher education. Early pilot findings indicate positive impacts on the classroom, including enhanced group dynamics and peer-to-peer learning. Online education is another big category that is being revolutionized by VR technologies. Stanford University and MIT have already incorporated VR learning environments into their executive education programs, providing their geographically diverse students with a simulated on-campus experience to facilitate group projects, discussions, and networking. The report also discusses tests by Pennsylvania State University, showing that when students were tasked with virtually assembling an object, students using a VR headset and a haptic glove completed the project more efficiently than students who relied on a mouse and keyboard. In another report, nursing students at Boise State are using VR headsets to learn proper procedures for inserting catheters. These virtual labs provide opportunities for risk-free, repeatable experimentation and simulation while allowing universities to serve students beyond the limits and constraints of physical laboratory space. To continue the discussions on how to leverage VR and AR for education, a few dedicated consultants were notable, including Peter Campbell at Experial, who left his job as Director of Strategy for Immersive Learning Solutions at Pearson, where he worked for 4 years. Lastly, VR platform giants like Oculus have invested millions in VR content with some notable diversity and education initiatives. Oculus in particular wants to make sure the next computing platform isn't dominated by just white males. They just added $10 million to their 3 existing programs, Launchpad, VR for Good, and Amplifying New Voices. Launchpad is a VR bootcamp to support promising VR content creators. Facebook is particularly interested in women, people of color, members of the LGBTQ community, and anyone who's willing to share how their perspective adds to the diversity of thought in the VR community. VR for Good is an initiative to help students and nonprofits capture community life. To do this, they use VR as an engine for empathy to impact social change. Amplifying New Voices is similar to the Launchpad program, but focuses more on crafting diverse leadership in the games, VR, and AR industries. Facebook is also investing $10 million into its NextGen program, which brings more Unity workshops and free VR hardware to universities so that they can expand their VR content creation programs and make education more immersive. The companies we've highlighted so far in this presentation are only a handful of over 200 we found in this space. Every week we seem to come across a new one that isn't on our list. VR and AR startup funding hit new highs last year with $2 billion invested and 190 deals made in 2016, according to DigiCapital. The number of startup investments in this space has lowered slightly in Q1 of this year, but we've also seen a lot more enthusiasm and commitment in the space coming from big established players such as Microsoft, Apple, Google, and major computer manufacturers like Acer, HP, Dell, and Lenovo. Companies that don't need to make deals but partnerships. Let's take a quick bird's eye view of all those industries. One category we haven't talked a lot about yet are the developer tools and game engines powering VR. They make up the second most important space in the industry after the headgear hardware itself. Unity is by far the biggest player in this space. Their software already powers half of all new mobile games and now 70% of all VR and AR experiences. They recently raised a staggering $400 million in May at a $2.6 billion valuation, after already raising $181 million last year. The Unreal Engine is probably the second most popular game engine for VR. It's known to be a little harder to use, but has among the best graphics in the industry alongside CryEngine, the third most popular framework. As an aside, both Unreal Engine and CryEngine were pulled out of real games and turned into reusable frameworks. Even Amazon is getting into the game engine space. They introduced their own game engine called Lumberyard. Reality capture is another major supporting industry segment, with many familiar consumer camera brands getting heavily involved. GoPro, for example, has focused on being an early pioneer in VR hardware, acquiring the premier 360 video stitching software company Color with a K back in 2015. Video stitching is an important step in 360 video capture since a single 360 camera lens doesn't exist, so the view from multiple camera lenses must be stitched together. The permutations of different 360 video camera styles is mind-boggling. Their cost can range from $99 to tens of thousands. Some of the more advanced cameras feature stereoscopic 360 capture and 360 positional audio. Due to data size, modern film formats, and the ability to share online to normal web users, monoscopic 360 seems to be the preferred format, though hopefully this changes in the future as it's less immersive. These two verticals, engine and tools and reality capture, form the content creation tools to empower all apps and content in VR. Now let's take a look at some verticals within apps and content. The most obvious VR use case is gaming. There are currently over 37 major gaming companies spearheading games in VR. This doesn't include solo developers. These companies include new VR companies created solely to make VR games, but also a lot of traditional game developer giants such as Capcom, known for their multi-million-dollar franchises such as Mega Man, Street Fighter, and many popular Disney games. Many of these companies are also being actively acquired by the big VR hardware giants. VR game studio Alchemy Labs, for example, just got acquired by Google. The entertainment space is probably the next big vertical. Companies like Baobab Studios plans to be the next Disney of VR. They're the ones that did the bunny video you saw earlier in this presentation. Virtual surgery and mental health and wellness are big drivers in the VR healthcare vertical. We've covered this vertical a lot already in these slides. In the social vertical, Altspace VR and VTime are the most notable. Facebook doesn't shine the brightest in this category quite yet, as their heavily promoted Facebook Spaces, which lets you be yourself in VR, is still in beta. Considering Facebook has the ownership and influence of Oculus Home to make sure everything ties in effortlessly with their social network, it's only a matter of time until they flip the switch. Until then, Altspace and VTime are eating Facebook's lunch when it comes to social VR. In the sports and live events vertical, NextVR takes the spot, having raised almost $120 million for live and on-demand VR. NextVR has more than 26 patents granted or pending for the capture, compression, transmission, and display of virtual reality content. The travel and tourism vertical is seeing a big boom from VR's popularity, with major networks like National Geographic's on board the VR train. Most travel content has the benefit of being evergreen, meaning the content never gets stale compared to a regular movie. In the enterprise space, you find the typical giants like Oculus and Google, but you also have smaller guys like Big Screen, a tiny startup in San Francisco that is notable for its dedicated focus on virtual screens within VR that tie into your real space. This vertical will definitely see tremendous growth as the price of hardware drops and more companies find the value of VR. The journalism category is steadily growing, with the New York Times being among the oldest experimenters. They're the ones that gave away 1 million Google Cardboards, exposing many people to VR for the very first time. Vice is another company that regularly creates 360 news content. And the last category, education, we already discussed in detail in other slides. Once apps and content are created, they need to be distributed. Oculus Home, Steam VR, and Daydream's Google Play VR are the primary ways users find and install apps and content for VR. But VR applications can also serve as their own distribution platforms. For example, if you wanted to make your 360 film accessible on major VR headsets, you can upload it to the Little Star app, which is already accessible by all major platforms. This concludes all the burgeoning industry verticals, what you need to make apps and content, and how to distribute it. Before we conclude our presentation, we just have 2 remaining sections to go over with you. This section, which highlights the challenges of today's VR, and the next, which discusses future trends. Inside this section, I also talk about the VR accessories available today, because in many cases they actually help solve these challenges. The biggest elephant in the room when it comes to challenges with today's VR is price. VR is still relatively expensive. In an effort to make pricing more transparent and realistic, I've went ahead and added the current bundle prices for each device, because if you want VR, you want the whole experience, not just the headset. At $70, the Daydream is the best price outside of getting a Google Cardboard, which we know is suboptimal. The most expensive device bundle, the HTC, is probably out of most people's reach. The problem with these prices is that it assumes you already have a souped-up Windows PC, PlayStation VR, or new enough Android smartphone. Without already owning a prerequisite device, the cost for accessible VR can more than double or quintuple in the case of Google Daydream. Though as with any technology, the price will go down. Because we are still in the first generation of real usable VR, we don't have much historical data points to know the velocity or timeline that this will happen. Still, doing the math, a single $1 million grant could provide over 2,300 headsets. Considering the average community college classroom is around 25 to 35 students, this could provide around 73 classrooms adequate VR functionality for years of quality use. Taking things further, if you wanted to provide a 30-unit VR lab in every community college in America, it would cost a little less than $19 million. This doesn't factor in the major discounts VR manufacturers could give education institutions and have done in the past. It's not such a faraway dream. The next few challenges have to do with the quest of constantly refining immersion and presence. One challenge is to lose the wires. We want the high-end tethered experience with the freedom of mobile VR. Wireless accessories like the TP-Cast for Vive attempt to solve this with a battery pack and transmitter that get attached to the top and back of the headset. The next challenge is to lose the external sensors but still have 6 degrees of freedom. Microsoft, Google, and Oculus are actively working on what they call inside-out tracking that uses computer vision to visually map out your surroundings via a camera on the actual VR headset instead of the external sensors we have today. This would allow the headset to know where you are in space by comparing you to the things around you. While nice to have for a VR headset, this is a key component of an AR headset. The next challenge is to lose all physical input devices. While the motion controllers are welcomed in interaction with the VR world, what if you could just use your hands? San Francisco-based Leap Motion has raised $44 million to do just that. Their USB device attaches to your headset, allowing not just hand gestures in VR, but full recognition of your articulated fingers to touch and manipulate objects in 3D space to your heart's content. You saw Leap Motion in action with the Alfred project earlier in this presentation. To manipulate objects in VR with other real-world objects, Vive is introducing the Vive Tracker. Vive says you can even mount the Vive Tracker to a DSLR camera in real life to take pictures in VR. Even with full room scale, your movement is restricted to a single room, and unexpected encounters with furniture isn't uncommon, though modern-day bounds detection systems help prevent that.
All current VR platforms currently work around the lack of unlimited movement by providing a means of aiming and teleporting to cover large distances using a controller. But with solutions like Virtual Omni Treadmill, you have the freedom to walk and run as you please. Showing and seeing emotion is an important part of being social. The Mind Maze mask is a ring of electrodes that can be installed on any VR headset's foam face mask to recognize your facial expressions in VR and translate them to an avatar.
Eye tracking hardware solves a problem in VR where the VR system knows which direction you're looking at, but not what in the scene you're actually looking at. If VR systems knew this, they can present things like natural focus with background depth of field, just like in real life. Eye contact along with emotional tracking would also bring a new level of realism to social VR. But most importantly, eye tracking allows VR systems to do something called foveated rendering. Foveated rendering allows the system to render things you look at in sharper detail and render things in the background in less detail. It would be a massive improvement in processor workload and lead to better quality graphics. Both Google and Oculus acquired eye tracking companies in late 2016 to work on this. Eye tracking is well on its way to a VR system near you. Related to the solution of foveated rendering, VR video has a massive problem where you're only looking at 110 degrees of 360 video at once, yet the whole thing is being rendered and streamed. This leads to a much lower quality video and much higher processing workload. Facebook is said to be working on building a solution where you load multiple video streams and only use the higher stream for the areas you're looking at. They're having problems with dynamically switching you to the higher stream fast enough as you look around. It's worth noting that even if Facebook perfects this solution, this kind of streaming and rendering logic only works within an application that's built for it. Regular video players aren't smart enough to use this kind of logic unless a new global standard is adopted. As VR devices become more commonplace, we'll need ways to keep sanitary and free from disease. In countries like Japan, creative sanitary covers for VR headsets are readily available like this one. But I wonder if there are other solutions we can come up with, like harnessing natural antimicrobial materials in headset production. Otherwise, I can't imagine taking a virtual reality driver's test at the DMV using a DMV-issued headset, or visiting the public library and getting online through a library headset. Lastly, there are challenges with display and graphic processors that are intrinsically linked. Swapping out the display with a higher resolution one that is capable of encompassing the whole human vision is a relatively easy challenge compared to rendering high quality graphics to match it on the processor side. It's the equivalent of having a 4K television at home but only playing DVDs. Major video card manufacturer Nvidia says VR is still 20 years away from resolutions that match the human eye. With the slowdown of transistor density, it's not an easy problem to fix. The current solutions are to use tricks and workarounds to pre-render scenes and make them look higher quality than they actually are. Technologies like foveated rendering will also make it so things you're not looking at can use less processor workload, letting the things you are render in much higher detail. Finally, let's talk a little bit about future trends. They mostly involve bringing greater access to VR. Until now, the only way to run a high-end VR system was to use a Windows-based PC. The Apple ecosystem has been mysteriously absent from VR so far. This is because most of Apple's popular products like the MacBook Pro use mobile video cards to cut down on size and energy usage. In the last couple of years, we've reached a point where CPU and video card improvements don't make much of a perceptible difference to the average computer user. Pushing video cards to their utmost limits is something really only needed for two areas: video rendering and 3D rendering, including high-end gaming. Now that VR has entered the mainstream, Apple is finally getting on board. Hot off the presses, Apple announced a partnership with Valve to bring SteamVR to the Mac just last month in June. They also just released their first powerful VR-compatible iMac, and most importantly, are releasing USB external graphic cards to allow VR on today's Macs. This is a huge step in getting VR accessible to more of the population, and we're sure the iPhone will be getting VR support next. Apple is also getting big into AR, which we'll be covering in our AR slides. Not only are more operating systems getting involved to help make VR more accessible to everyone, but there's also a movement to make VR more web-friendly. Instead of loading SteamVR or Oculus Home apps on your headset, can you imagine just plugging in straight to a VR web browser to have direct, immersive experiences online? Many in the industry believe the next frontier for VR are these web-based experiences that can be visited and accessed across all platforms. In the future, the VR web can be the single unified platform that all VR devices share. So there we have it. I hope you learned a thing or two in this presentation. The biggest takeaway is that VR is not a fad like it was in the 90s, and that it's documented to be both useful and effective across multiple industries, including education. Like smartphones, it's becoming a permanent part of our society going forward. We also learned that VR is not just for games, though entertainment and engagement are a big part of what makes VR so popular. Canadian professor and philosopher Marshall McLuhan famously said, "If you think there's a difference between education and entertainment, you don't understand much about either." While kind of harsh, it does make sense. Sometimes we think of education as this awful tasting medicine you have to take to be successful, but maybe making it fun and engaging can change that. For those that are still unsure about the idea of putting on a VR headset, consider that the first form of virtual reality was really the telephone. It enabled two people, separated by distance, to virtually be together audibly. Later on, video conferencing let us see each other. VR seems like the next natural step for virtually being and working together. Thanks for sticking with me throughout this whole presentation. I appreciate it. Comments, questions, suggestions? Let us know what you think.